chartered yacht known as the Witchcraft departed the waters near Miami, a coastline already defined by constant maritime traffic, shifting currents, and the quiet precision of routine navigation. What began as an ordinary coastal excursion between experienced passengers and a well-regarded vessel would soon become one of the most persistent maritime disappearances recorded in the region, unfolding in waters that were heavily travelled, closely monitored, and yet ultimately unable to account for what occurred offshore. In this account, you will move through the final known movements of the vessel, the radio communication that followed an unexpected disturbance at sea, and the rapid response that led rescuers into open water where nothing was ultimately found. Each stage of the investigation reveals how a routine situation dissolved into uncertainty, leaving behind no confirmed wreckage, no definitive trace, and a series of unanswered conditions that continue to define the case within maritime history. The night. The coastline went silent. The lights along the Miami shoreline seemed almost suspended above the water on the evening of December the 22nd, 1967, glowing against the dark Atlantic air with the quiet steadiness of a holiday postcard. Pleasure boats moved slowly through Biscayne Bay, while hotels and apartment towers along the coast reflected bands of gold and red across the surface below, creating the illusion that the city itself had drifted out onto the ocean. It was the kind of calm winter night South Florida was known for, warm enough for open decks and light clothing, with no violent weather warnings and no sign that anything unusual was about to unfold, only a short distance from shore. Yet before the night ended, one yacht and the 2 men aboard it would disappear so completely that investigators would later struggle to explain how an emergency so close to Miami could leave behind absolutely nothing. The vessel at the centre of the mystery carried a name that would later seem strangely fitting. The Witchcraft was a 23-foot cabin cruiser, owned by Daniel Dan Burak, a well-known Miami hotel owner and experienced boater who spent years around the waters of South Florida. Burak operated the Miami Beach hotel chain known as the Burak Hotels and was regarded by friends as careful rather than reckless, especially when it came to his boat. Reports from the time described him as deeply familiar with Biscayne Bay and the nearby coastline, an area crowded with pleasure craft, fishing boats, marinas and Coast Guard activity. Nothing about the planned outing suggested danger. It was meant to be a short nighttime trip to admire Miami's Christmas lights from the water before returning to shore. Accompanying Burak that evening was Father Patrick Horgan, a Catholic priest originally from St. Louis who had become friends with him during visits to Florida. Horgan had reportedly been looking forward to seeing the shoreline illuminated for the holidays, a seasonal tradition that drew countless residents and tourists onto the water every December. The timing mattered because Miami in the late 1960s was rapidly transforming into a brighter and more crowded coastal city, its skyline expanding year after year as new hotels and residential towers appeared along the bay. Seen from offshore at night, the coastline carried an almost theatrical appearance, with rows of decorative lights stretching across the dark horizon, while aircraft crossed overhead toward Miami International Airport. For many boat owners, cruising offshore during the Christmas season had become part of the atmosphere of the city itself. Burak's confidence in the Witchcraft was rooted partly in the modifications he had personally added to the vessel. Accounts published after the disappearance noted that he considered the yacht exceptionally safe, even unsinkable under ordinary circumstances. The boat reportedly included special flotation devices designed to keep it afloat if trouble occurred, an important detail that later shaped nearly every theory surrounding the case. Small cabin cruisers of that era could still capsize or take on water under the wrong conditions, particularly at night. But Burak believed his vessel possessed enough buoyancy to remain visible even if damaged. Friends later recalled that he trusted the boat completely, which may explain why the evening trip appeared so casual from the beginning. The waters around Biscayne Bay were familiar to local mariners, yet they also concealed hazards beneath their calm appearance. Sandbars shifted over time, submerged debris occasionally drifted into navigational routes, and isolated wreckage from older vessels rested below the surface in certain areas. Still, conditions that evening appeared unusually favourable for boating. Contemporary reports described the weather as calm, with clear visibility and relatively light seas. There were no reports of storms approaching the Miami area that night, and the yacht remained close to shore rather than venturing into the open Atlantic. That detail would become one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire disappearance, because the Witchcraft never travelled into some distant or remote section of ocean. It remained within sight of one of the busiest coastlines in the United States. As darkness deepened, the shoreline became brighter rather than dimmer. Christmas decorations illuminated waterfront homes and marinas, while reflections trembled across the bay in long, distorted streaks. Boats anchored offshore often watched the city in silence, surrounded by the low hum of engines carrying across the water. In later years, investigators and writers repeatedly returned to the same disturbing question surrounding that night. How could a vessel vanish so quickly in such an active and heavily observed area? Miami's coastal waters were not isolated wilderness. Aircraft crossed overhead constantly. Commercial traffic moved through nearby channels, and Coast Guard stations operated within minutes of the location where Burak and Horgan were believed to be drifting. Sometime later that evening, Burak guided the Witchcraft to an area near the marker buoy outside Miami Harbour, reportedly less than a mile from shore. The decision carried no obvious risk. Boats frequently paused there to enjoy the skyline, and the waters were considered manageable for experienced operators. According to later Coast Guard accounts, Burak would eventually report that the yacht had apparently struck something submerged, though the situation did not initially sound catastrophic. There was no frantic emergency transmission, and no immediate indication that the vessel was sinking. The tone of the situation, at least in those early moments, appeared calm enough that rescuers believed they were responding to a disabled pleasure craft, rather than the beginning of one of the most baffling maritime disappearances in American history. The apparent ordinariness of the evening became part of the mystery itself. There were no reports of panic before the yacht vanished, no confirmed sightings of severe waves, and no evidence that Burak intended to disappear voluntarily. The two men had left on what should have been a brief excursion close to land during favourable weather, aboard a boat its owner considered highly secure. Every known detail pointed toward an event that should have ended with a simple return to shore later that night. Instead, the calm conditions surrounding the voyage only deepened the unease that followed, because the safer the circumstances appeared, the harder it became to explain what happened next. Even decades later, investigators continued returning to the image of the Witchcraft resting somewhere beneath the glow of Miami's Christmas lights, while the city carried on unaware that, only minutes away, something had already begun to go terribly wrong. Then the Coast Guard received a call that sounded far too ordinary to become the beginning of a disappearance. The distress call that should have been routine. A voice carried across the Coast Guard radio that night with none of the urgency normally associated with disaster at sea. The transmission sounded controlled, direct, and strangely ordinary, especially considering what investigators would later realise had already begun unfolding somewhere beyond the glow of the Miami shoreline. In the years after the disappearance of the Witchcraft, that brief exchange became one of the most scrutinised moments in the entire case, because nothing about it suggested panic, confusion, or immediate danger. There was no shouted mayday call breaking through static, no reports of flooding compartments, and no indication that the vessel was about to vanish without leaving behind a single confirmed trace. Instead, the communication sounded like the kind of minor boating problem South Florida authorities handled routinely during busy evenings on Biscayne Bay. Routine maritime calls moved through Miami's coastal channels constantly during the late 1960s, especially around busy holiday weekends when pleasure craft crowded the bay after sunset. Coast Guard operators stationed along the coastline regularly assisted stranded boaters dealing with dead batteries, damaged propellers, navigational mistakes, or mechanical failures near harbour entrances. Most incidents ended quietly. A rescue vessel would locate the disabled craft, provide assistance or a tow back to shore, and the event would disappear into routine paperwork by morning. The waters surrounding Miami were heavily travelled compared to many coastal regions in the United States, particularly during December, when visitors filled the city and local boat owners gathered offshore to admire Christmas lights reflecting across Biscayne Bay. Against that backdrop, the transmission from the Witchcraft initially sounded unremarkable. Somewhere near the outer marker buoy beyond Miami Harbour, Dan Burak calmly informed authorities that the Witchcraft had apparently struck an object beneath the surface. Accounts of the call differ slightly in wording depending on later reports, but the essential details remained consistent. Burak explained that the yacht was not sinking, yet he requested assistance because something had likely damaged the vessel. The location he provided placed the cruiser astonishingly close to shore, reportedly less than a mile from Miami's coastline. That fact shaped every decision that followed, because rescuers had little reason to believe they were entering a dangerous situation. The Witchcraft remained near one of the busiest harbour approaches in Florida, within an area crossed constantly by commercial traffic, private boats, and Coast Guard patrols. Nothing in the brief communication suggested that the 23-foot cabin cruiser was in immediate danger of sinking or drifting out into open water. Burak reportedly remained composed throughout the exchange, and no emergency distress code was issued during the call. Maritime radio procedures already existed for catastrophic emergencies, particularly situations involving imminent danger to life or vessel, but the tone of this communication did not appear to justify such measures. That detail would later become deeply unsettling because investigators could not reconcile the calmness of the call with the total disappearance that followed only minutes later. If conditions aboard the yacht had deteriorated rapidly after the transmission ended, there was no evidence showing when or how that escalation occurred. Inside Coast Guard stations along the South Florida coastline, situations like this were generally treated as straightforward nighttime assistance operations rather than emergencies. Rescue crews responding to disabled vessels near harbour entrances operated with speed, but not with the expectation of catastrophe. The reported position of the Witchcraft was close enough that authorities believed they could locate the vessel quickly using spotlights and visual contact alone. The surrounding area was illuminated not only by navigation markers and harbour traffic, but also by the bright skyline of Miami itself. Unlike disappearances occurring far offshore in storms or isolated waters, this incident unfolded against the backdrop of a major American city alive with lights, movement, and constant activity. Because the yacht remained so close to shore, rescuers expected the search to last minutes rather than hours. Coast Guard personnel moved toward the reported coordinates, anticipating a damaged but visible cruiser waiting calmly for assistance. Nothing about the weather suggested a severe maritime emergency. Historical weather reports from the evening described relatively calm seas and good visibility conditions across the Miami area. There were no major storms approaching the coastline, no reports of unusually violent swells, and no indication that another vessel had collided with the Witchcraft. In ordinary circumstances, even a partially disabled boat drifting in those waters should have been visible almost immediately after rescuers arrived nearby. Across Biscayne Bay, the glow from Miami's hotels and waterfront buildings still stretched visibly across the dark water as the response vessel moved toward the reported location. Aircraft lights crossed above the city while harbour traffic continued moving through nearby channels, creating the impression of a coastline fully awake and heavily observed. The closer rescuers approached the area identified by Burak, however, the more unusual the situation became. The yacht's navigation lights were nowhere to be seen. No drifting silhouette appeared against the reflections coming from shore. The waters ahead looked strangely empty, despite the expectation that a 23-foot cabin cruiser should have been sitting directly within view. What waited ahead was not a damaged cruiser or stranded passengers, but an expanse of empty water where the Witchcraft should have been drifting. Coast Guard crews arriving near the marker buoy reportedly found nothing at all. No sign of Burak, no sign of Father Patrick Horgan, no visible wreckage. Even before the broader search began, the disappearance had already become difficult to explain because so little time had passed between the distress call and the arrival of rescuers. Under normal circumstances, a disabled vessel located less than a mile offshore could not simply vanish without witnesses, debris, or some indication of where it had gone. Searchlights swept slowly across the surface while Coast Guard crews scanned for anything capable of reflecting light back through the darkness. The operation initially focused on locating the yacht itself, but attention soon shifted toward finding any evidence suggesting what had happened after the transmission ended. Life jackets, flotation cushions, fuel slicks, broken planks, personal belongings, or overturned hulls were all possibilities investigators expected to encounter somewhere within the surrounding waters. Maritime accidents rarely erase every physical trace immediately, especially in relatively calm conditions close to shore. Yet the search crews saw only black water moving beneath the reflections of Miami's skyline. Repeated radio calls into the night received no reply from Burak, Father Patrick Horgan, or the vessel itself. The silence deepened the confusion because radio failures alone could not explain the complete absence of the yacht. If the Witchcraft had suffered serious damage after striking an underwater object, the flotation devices Burak reportedly trusted should have kept some portion of the vessel visible above the surface. Friends later recalled his confidence that the cruiser was exceptionally safe compared to ordinary boats of similar size. That belief became central to the mystery, because investigators struggled to understand how a vessel designed to remain buoyant could disappear so completely within such a short span of time. Nearby boaters and harbour traffic reported no collision, explosion, distress flares, or signs of sudden catastrophe anywhere near the yacht's last known position. The lack of eyewitness accounts became increasingly important as the hours passed because the waters surrounding Miami were rarely isolated or empty for long. Commercial ships moved through nearby approaches while pleasure craft crossed Biscayne Bay throughout the evening. Had the Witchcraft capsized violently or suffered some visible accident near the marker buoy, investigators expected someone to notice unusual activity on the water. Instead, the disappearance unfolded almost invisibly despite occurring near one of the most active coastal regions in Florida. Even under severe maritime accidents, investigators typically expect debris fields, floating cushions, fuel slicks, or fragments capable of revealing where a vessel went down. Search operations later expanded dramatically, yet the first and most disturbing mystery emerged during those initial moments when rescuers reached the coordinates and found only empty water waiting beneath the glow of the city. The absence of physical evidence transformed what should have been a routine nighttime assistance call into something far more unsettling because it suggested either an extraordinarily rapid disaster or an event unlike ordinary maritime accidents altogether. The absence of wreckage became even harder to explain because Burak reportedly believed the Witchcraft had been modified to remain afloat under circumstances that would sink ordinary boats. Reports published after the disappearance describe flotation materials installed aboard the cruiser, specifically to increase its survivability if damaged. While small boats can certainly vanish under difficult conditions, investigators found themselves confronting a case where the surrounding facts consistently contradicted the expected outcome. Calm weather, nearby shorelines, quick rescue response and additional flotation should have increased the likelihood of survival or recovery. Instead, every factor that should have made the incident easier to solve only deepened the mystery. As the search area widened beyond the harbour approaches, the calm conditions that initially reassured rescuers began turning into one of the most troubling aspects of the case. Rough seas might have explained scattered debris drifting away from the scene, while storms could have obscured visibility or delayed rescue vessels. But none of those conditions existed that night. Biscayne Bay remained navigable, the skyline remained visible, and the Coast Guard had responded rapidly after receiving Burak's transmission. The more investigators examined the timeline, the more difficult it became to explain how an entire yacht could disappear so quickly in waters that should have exposed even the smallest trace of an accident. Long after midnight, aircraft and patrol boats continued moving across waters that should have surrendered some evidence of the missing cruiser by then. Search crews scanned areas extending far beyond the original coordinates while attempting to account for tides, drift patterns, and possible current movement carrying debris away from the scene. Yet the darkness surrounding the Witchcraft only seemed to deepen with every passing hour. No confirmed fragment of the yacht emerged from the water. No verified sighting of Burak or Horgan followed the distress call. What began as a simple request for assistance had already transformed into one of the strangest disappearances in American maritime history. Within sight of the Miami skyline, the Witchcraft had disappeared as though the water itself had erased it, vanished, within sight of Miami. Barely a mile separated the Witchcraft from the illuminated coastline of Miami when the yacht disappeared into the darkness. That single detail continued haunting investigators long after the initial search ended because distance usually determines whether maritime accidents become survivable emergencies or permanent mysteries. Vessels vanish in storms far offshore. Boats disappear in isolated waters where rescue crews arrive too late. But the Witchcraft did not vanish in the middle of an empty ocean. It disappeared beside one of the most populated and active coastlines in the United States, close enough for the lights of Miami to remain visible from the deck of the yacht itself. The geography surrounding the case transformed an already troubling disappearance into something far harder to explain because nearly every condition that normally improves the odds of rescue had been present that night. From the harbour approaches near Biscayne Bay, the skyline remained visible throughout the evening, glowing above the water in long reflections broken only by passing boat traffic. Miami in the late 1960s already carried the appearance of a rapidly expanding coastal metropolis, with hotels, apartment towers, marinas, restaurants, and busy waterfront districts stretching across the shoreline. Christmas decorations illuminated sections of the coast, while aircraft descended steadily toward Miami International Airport, their lights crossing above the bay throughout the night. The waters near the harbour entrance were rarely isolated for long because private cruisers, fishing vessels, commercial traffic, and Coast Guard patrols moved constantly through the area. The Witchcraft vanished within view of all of it. Unlike maritime disappearances that unfold far offshore beyond shipping routes and populated coastlines, this incident occurred beside one of the busiest waterfront regions in Florida. The reported location near the outer marker buoy placed the yacht close to navigational routes entering Miami Harbour, an area familiar to experienced local boaters like Dan Burak. Harbour markers, navigation lights, and shoreline illumination reduced many of the risks associated with nighttime boating in open ocean waters. Even after sunset, Biscayne Bay remained active because South Florida's climate allowed recreational boating year-round, particularly during the holiday season when calm winter evenings drew residents and tourists onto the water. Investigators later struggled with the fact that the Witchcraft disappeared in a place where rescue should have been relatively simple. Charts of the area surrounding the outer marker buoy revealed a heavily travelled section of water used constantly by pleasure craft, fishing vessels, harbour pilots, and Coast Guard patrols. While the waters near Miami contained hazards beneath the surface, including sandbars, shifting channels, and occasional submerged debris, they were also among the most monitored coastal waters in the region. Nearby marinas lined portions of the bay, while larger commercial vessels routinely entered and exited harbour approaches under careful navigation. The proximity to shore mattered because experienced investigators understood how difficult it normally is for a vessel to disappear completely near an urban coastline. Boats sink, boats capsize, boats drift. But they almost always leave behind something visible enough to begin reconstructing events. Weather observations recorded across the Miami area that night described conditions that experienced boaters generally considered manageable and relatively calm. Reports from December 22, 1967 indicated favourable boating weather, with no major storms threatening South Florida during the evening hours. Wind conditions remained relatively stable, and there were no reports of rough seas severe enough to explain the sudden destruction of a small cruiser close to shore. This absence of violent weather became one of the most important facts in the entire case, because environmental conditions often provide investigators with the clearest explanation during maritime disappearances. Storms scatter debris, reduce visibility, delay rescue operations, and increase the likelihood of catastrophic accidents. Yet none of those conditions existed around the Witchcraft that night. No hurricane systems threatened South Florida during the disappearance, and there were no reports of violent seas capable of immediately swallowing a small cruiser without witnesses. Even if the yacht had struck a submerged object exactly as Burak reported during the distress call, investigators still expected some evidence to emerge afterward. A partially submerged hull, floating cushions, life jackets, fragments of fiberglass, or oil slicks would normally appear somewhere within the surrounding search area. Small boats rarely vanish instantly, especially under calm conditions close to populated shorelines. The absence of wreckage forced authorities to confront a deeply unusual possibility. Either the Witchcraft had disappeared with extraordinary speed, or the evidence itself had somehow escaped detection in waters where visibility and rescue access should have favoured recovery. Across the waters surrounding Miami Harbour, navigation lights, marina activity, and aircraft descending toward the city created an environment where darkness rarely became complete. This was not a remote section of coastline where a sinking vessel could drift unnoticed for hours beneath storm clouds or heavy fog. Artificial light spilled constantly across the bay from waterfront buildings and moving boats, while the nearby city produced a glow visible for miles offshore. At various points throughout the evening, vessels continued passing through nearby channels. Yet despite the traffic and illumination surrounding the harbour approaches, nobody reported witnessing the Witchcraft sinking, colliding violently with another vessel, or signalling distress after the original Coast Guard call. Commercial vessels and private boats moved through nearby channels throughout the evening, reinforcing how active the surrounding waters remained at the very time the yacht vanished. Miami's waterways operated almost continuously, because the harbour served both recreational and commercial activity. Tugboats guided larger ships through designated channels while pleasure craft crossed Biscayne Bay beneath the skyline. Fishing vessels returned toward docks after sunset. Smaller cruisers drifted offshore to watch the city lights reflected across the water. Under ordinary circumstances, a disabled 23-foot cabin cruiser floating near a marker buoy should have attracted attention quickly, particularly after Coast Guard crews began searching the area. Yet the Witchcraft seemed to disappear without interrupting the normal movement of the bay around it. Under ordinary maritime circumstances, even severe accidents near shore tend to leave behind visible evidence that investigators can follow through the water. Search and rescue operations often begin with fragments rather than complete wrecks. A single floating seat cushion can establish a drift direction. Oil slicks reveal possible sinking locations. Personal belongings carried by currents allow investigators to calculate movement across open water. In some cases, even small fragments of paint or wood become critical clues. Maritime investigators rely heavily on the physical behaviour of water, because oceans and bays rarely conceal every trace of an accident immediately. The Witchcraft challenged those assumptions from the beginning. Floating debris, fuel slicks, damaged hull sections, life preservers, or distress flares typically provide the first clues after a vessel sinks unexpectedly. Even in difficult conditions, rescue teams usually recover at least fragments capable of narrowing a search area. The Witchcraft produced none of them. The Coast Guard's rapid arrival near the reported location should have increased the likelihood of spotting evidence before currents carried it away, yet the waters remained empty. Later investigators repeatedly returned to that detail because timing mattered enormously in maritime disappearances. The shorter the gap between distress call and rescue response, the harder it becomes to explain a total absence of physical evidence. Instead of revealing answers, the waters surrounding the yacht's last known location seemed to absorb every trace investigators expected to recover. Biscayne Bay itself presented a strange contrast of visibility and concealment. The surface waters near Miami often appeared calm and transparent under favourable conditions, yet beneath them existed channels, wreckage sites, strong tidal movement, and sudden depth changes capable of complicating underwater searches. Even so, those underwater hazards could not fully explain why no one saw the yacht after the distress call ended. The mystery deepened not because the bay was completely unknowable, but because the surrounding environment appeared too accessible and too heavily travelled to permit such a clean disappearance. Search crews attempting to reconstruct the timeline soon found themselves confronting an increasingly disturbing contradiction between the calm environment and the complete absence of evidence. Every verified fact surrounding the disappearance seemed to undermine ordinary explanations rather than support them. The yacht remained near shore, the weather remained stable, the rescue response was fast, the harbour remained active, visibility remained relatively clear. Yet the outcome resembled disappearances more commonly associated with violent storms or isolated stretches of ocean far beyond immediate rescue range. Investigators were left trying to understand how all the normal safeguards surrounding coastal boating had failed simultaneously within sight of Miami itself. Distance alone could not explain the disappearance because the Witchcraft never entered isolated ocean territory beyond the reach of immediate rescue response. That fact distinguished the case from many other maritime mysteries tied to the Atlantic coastline, or the broader legends surrounding the Bermuda Triangle. Boats disappearing hundreds of miles offshore often leave unanswered questions because recovery becomes extraordinarily difficult in deep ocean conditions. The Witchcraft case unfolded under nearly opposite circumstances. The yacht vanished near land, near harbour traffic, near Coast Guard resources, and near one of America's brightest coastal skylines. The impossibility of the location became just as unsettling as the disappearance itself. Beneath the surface of Biscayne Bay, shifting currents and underwater hazards certainly existed, yet none appeared capable of accounting for a total disappearance occurring so quickly and so close to shore. Marine environments are unpredictable by nature, and investigators acknowledge that accidents can unfold rapidly even in familiar waters, but ordinary maritime accidents usually leave patterns investigators can follow afterward. The Witchcraft left none. Instead, the case created the impression of an event that unfolded almost invisibly, despite occurring in a heavily observed section of water, surrounded by artificial light, harbour movement, and constant activity. Marine investigators later acknowledged that proximity to land usually improves the likelihood of survival, detection, or recovery after nighttime boating accidents. Coastal disappearances are generally easier to investigate because search operations can deploy quickly, while witnesses, radar activity, harbour records, and nearby vessels help narrow timelines. The Witchcraft contradicted nearly all of those expectations. Even decades later, the disappearance continued troubling maritime researchers, precisely because it occurred in a location where investigators believed answers should have emerged rapidly. Instead, the bay surrendered nothing at all. What should have been one of the easiest rescue locations in South Florida was about to become the center of an enormous search that found nothing at all. The search operation that found absolutely nothing. Before dawn reached the waters surrounding Miami Harbor, rescue operations had already begun expanding far beyond the yacht's last reported position. What initially appeared to be a routine nighttime assistance call was rapidly becoming something far more serious because the expected evidence simply was not there. The Coast Guard had responded quickly after Dan Burek's transmission, yet the Witchcraft was already gone by the time rescuers arrived near the marker buoy. During the first hours after the disappearance, authorities still believed the situation might resolve itself through ordinary search procedures. A drifting cruiser could be located. Survivors might still be visible somewhere in the surrounding waters. Debris carried by currents could reveal where the yacht had gone down. Maritime rescues often begin with uncertainty, before gradually narrowing toward answers. In the case of the Witchcraft, the opposite occurred. Initial search sweeps concentrated around the outer marker buoy, where Coast Guard crews expected to locate the Witchcraft drifting nearby or partially disabled in the dark. The reported location remained close enough to shore that rescuers believed visual contact should occur quickly once patrol vessels reached the area. Navigation markers, harbour traffic, and the glow from Miami's skyline still illuminated portions of the bay despite the late hour. Searchlights moved methodically across the surface while crews scanned for navigation lights, floating debris, or human movement in the water. The expectation during those early moments remained procedural rather than desperate, because authorities still assumed the yacht existed somewhere within a manageable radius of the distress call. Patrol vessels moved repeatedly across Biscayne Bay, while spotlights traced wide arcs over water that appeared empty in every direction. The bay itself presented an unusual mixture of accessibility and concealment. Close to shore, the waters surrounding Miami were heavily travelled and relatively familiar to local mariners, yet nighttime visibility over open water could still distort distance and orientation, even under calm conditions. Search crews understood that small vessels sometimes drift farther than expected after mechanical failure or collision, particularly if currents gradually pulled them away from navigational markers. But the complete absence of visible wreckage near the yacht's last known position immediately complicated those assumptions. A disabled 23-foot cruiser should have revealed itself somehow. Calculations involving tide movement, wind direction, and nighttime currents soon became critical as search coordinators attempted to predict where debris or survivors might drift. Maritime searches rely heavily on environmental analysis, because ocean movement often determines where evidence eventually appears after accidents at sea. Investigators studied weather conditions, tidal patterns, and the probable drift rate of floating objects leaving the area near the harbour entrance. Biscayne Bay connected directly to broader Atlantic waters through channels and openings capable of carrying debris outward over time, particularly if currents strengthened after the disappearance. Yet even those calculations depended on the existence of something recoverable moving across the water, and the Witchcraft continued providing nothing for search crews to track. Aircraft joined the operation after sunrise, widening the search area across sections of the Atlantic where investigators believed some trace of the missing cruiser should eventually surface. From above, aerial searches offered advantages impossible from sea level, because crews could scan larger areas quickly while identifying patterns or objects hidden from patrol boats below. Helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft crossed over the coastline, Biscayne Bay, and nearby Atlantic waters while observers searched for anything disrupting the surface beneath them. Maritime search operations often become easier after daylight, because reflections, fuel slicks, and floating debris become more visible once the sun rises over open water. The daylight surrounding the Witchcraft search revealed only more empty water. From above the water, crews scanned for reflections, oil slicks, overturned hull sections, flotation cushions, or movement capable of indicating survivors below. Investigators expected even partial evidence to emerge eventually, because catastrophic sinkings near shore rarely erase every physical trace immediately. Fiberglass fragments can remain afloat for long periods. Upholstery cushions drift unpredictably across open water. Fuel leaking from damaged vessels often leaves visible sheens spreading across the surface. In some maritime disasters, debris fields begin appearing within hours. Yet despite aerial visibility and expanding patrol coverage, authorities still failed to locate anything definitively connected to the missing yacht. Nothing recovered during those early hours resembled the aftermath of a conventional boating accident near shore. That distinction became increasingly important as the operation widened, because experienced rescuers understood how maritime disasters usually unfold. Even when vessels sink rapidly, surrounding waters tend to preserve fragments capable of reconstructing events afterward. Search crews often begin piecing together accidents through scattered physical clues long before full wrecks are located. The Witchcraft offered no such progression. The search operation expanded outward across the water while the Disappearance itself remained strangely featureless. Search coordinators gradually extended patrol routes farther from Miami, as the possibility emerged that currents may have carried wreckage beyond the initial response zone. By then, the search had evolved beyond the assumption that the yacht remained drifting harmlessly near the marker buoy. Rescue teams began accounting for scenarios involving capsizing, sudden flooding, or uncontrolled movement into broader Atlantic waters. Additional vessels joined portions of the operation, while authorities widened grid searches beyond Biscayne Bay itself. The scale of the response reflected how seriously the Disappearance was now being treated, particularly because the initial distress call had sounded so minor only hours earlier. Across thousands of square miles of water, Coast Guard personnel and civilian volunteers continued looking for evidence that never appeared. Reports from the investigation later described an enormous search effort stretching through sections of South Florida's coastal waters and nearby Atlantic routes. Civilian boaters participated alongside official rescue crews, adding additional eyes across areas where floating wreckage or survivors might emerge. Maritime communities often respond quickly during disappearances because local captains understand how rapidly conditions at sea can change, even during favourable weather. Yet the combined effort only deepened the mystery surrounding the Witchcraft, because the larger the search became, the more unusual the absence of evidence appeared. Experienced maritime rescuers understood that even small vessels usually leave behind physical clues after catastrophic sinkings, particularly in coastal waters with rapid emergency response. Boats destroyed during collisions or severe flooding rarely vanish cleanly beneath the surface, without dispersing materials outward through waves and currents. Investigators involved in marine recoveries become accustomed to tracing accidents backward through debris patterns, fuel traces, and drifting personal belongings. These physical remnants often tell the first part of the story before divers or sonar equipment ever locate submerged wreckage. The Witchcraft interrupted that process completely because there was no identifiable trail leading anywhere. Fuel sheens, scattered fiberglass fragments, damaged life jackets, or floating personal belongings often become the first pieces of evidence recovered during marine searches. Even human remains occasionally surface relatively quickly in warm coastal waters, depending on current movement and environmental conditions. Search crews involved in the Witchcraft operation anticipated at least some indication that an accident had occurred after the distress call ended. The longer the search continued without results, however, the more investigators found themselves confronting a disappearance that behaved unlike ordinary maritime disasters. Each missing clue became part of the mystery itself. Instead of narrowing the mystery, each additional search path seemed only to reinforce the complete absence of identifiable wreckage connected to the Witchcraft. Search aircraft crossed repeatedly over sections of water where drift calculations suggested debris should eventually collect, yet observers reported nothing conclusive below. Patrol vessels moved through expanding grids while attempting to eliminate possible locations systematically. The operation became increasingly defined not by discoveries, but by empty returns. In most maritime cases, searchers gradually shrink uncertainty by recovering physical evidence piece by piece. Here, uncertainty expanded alongside the search itself. Helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft crossed repeatedly above South Florida's waters, while patrol crews below maintained expanding grid patterns through the bay and nearby Atlantic routes. The geography surrounding Miami complicated the operation in subtle ways, because strong tidal movement and open access to Atlantic currents created countless possible drift paths for wreckage. Search coordinators continuously revised calculations as hours passed and environmental conditions shifted. Yet despite those adjustments, the investigation remained trapped by the same impossible fact. Nothing from the Witchcraft could be found anywhere. Records from the investigation later showed how methodically authorities attempted to account for possible drift scenarios using weather data and water movement calculations. Maritime rescue operations depend heavily on predictive models because even small variations in wind or current direction can move floating objects across large distances over time. Investigators considered the possibility that the yacht itself had drifted away from the reported location before sinking, while debris may have travelled separately afterward. But every theory eventually returned to the same problem. No verified wreckage ever emerged to support any reconstruction of the event. No verified distress flare, emergency raft, human remains, or confirmed debris field ever emerged from the widening search area, despite the scale of the operation. The absence became increasingly difficult to rationalise because the search itself had been extensive, immediate, and concentrated within waters that should have favoured recovery. Many maritime disappearances remain unsolved because search efforts begin too late or environmental conditions destroy evidence quickly. The Witchcraft case unfolded under almost opposite circumstances. Authorities responded rapidly, conditions remained manageable, resources expanded. Still, the bay and nearby Atlantic waters surrendered nothing. As the days passed, the rescue effort slowly transformed into a recovery search, conducted across waters that continued withholding every expected answer. Hope of locating survivors diminished while investigators shifted attention toward finding even the smallest fragment capable of explaining what happened after Burak's distress call. Yet the operation remained trapped in a strange contradiction. The larger and more thorough the search became, the less believable the disappearance seemed. A yacht had vanished near one of America's busiest coastlines, without producing a single confirmed physical trace. Investigators eventually found themselves confronting a maritime disappearance that violated nearly every normal pattern associated with sinkings near populated coastlines. The case no longer resembled an ordinary boating accident complicated by bad weather or delayed response. Instead, it became a disappearance defined by absence itself. No wreckage, no witnesses, no bodies, no fuel slick, no distress flare, and no confirmed explanation. Long after official search operations ended, the unanswered questions surrounding the Witchcraft continued haunting maritime investigators, precisely because the search effort had been so great and so immediate. The more extensively authorities searched for the Witchcraft, the more unsettling it became that the yacht had reportedly been equipped with features intended to keep it afloat. A yacht designed not to sink. Long before theories about the disappearance began spreading beyond South Florida, investigators found themselves studying the Witchcraft itself for answers. The search operation had already produced an outcome that experienced rescuers considered deeply unusual. No debris field had formed across the water. No fuel slick drifted away from the yacht's last known position. No partially submerged hull emerged from Biscayne Bay after the distress call ended. As authorities attempted to understand how a 23-foot cabin cruiser could vanish so completely near Miami's coastline, attention increasingly shifted toward the vessel's construction and the safety features its owner reportedly trusted. The mystery surrounding the Witchcraft deepened because the yacht was not widely described as fragile, unstable, or poorly equipped for the waters where it disappeared. Unlike many small pleasure craft operating along the Florida coastline during the 1960s, Dan Burak's yacht reportedly carried additional safety features intended to improve survivability on the water. Burak was not an inexperienced boater unfamiliar with the risks surrounding Biscayne Bay and nearby Atlantic routes. Friends and later reports described him as careful and confident in the vessel's reliability, particularly during short coastal outings close to shore. That confidence became important after the disappearance, because investigators gradually realized the Witchcraft had supposedly been equipped with flotation materials designed specifically to help prevent catastrophic sinking. Under ordinary circumstances, those modifications should have increased the likelihood that at least part of the yacht remained visible after any serious damage occurred. Built as a 23-foot cabin cruiser, the Witchcraft belonged to a class of recreational boats designed primarily for coastal travel and relatively calm conditions near shore. Cabin cruisers of that era balanced comfort and utility, allowing owners to navigate bays, harbours, and nearby coastal waters without venturing far into dangerous offshore conditions. Many featured enclosed cabins, fiberglass hull construction, and buoyant structural elements intended to improve stability during routine operation. While no small pleasure craft could be considered unsinkable in absolute terms, vessels of similar size often remained partially afloat after collisions or flooding incidents long enough for rescuers to recover passengers or locate wreckage afterward. That expectation became central to the mystery once the Witchcraft disappeared without leaving visible evidence behind. Accounts published after the disappearance described Burak as unusually confident in the vessel's ability to remain afloat even after sustaining serious damage. Reports concerning the yacht's flotation features circulated repeatedly in the years following the incident because they contradicted the apparent outcome of the disappearance itself. According to multiple accounts, Burak believed the boat's buoyancy systems would keep it afloat under conditions that might sink ordinary vessels. Whether that confidence reflected precise engineering knowledge or simply trust gained through experience, it shaped later interpretations of the case. Investigators and maritime observers continued returning to the same troubling question. If the Witchcraft was truly equipped to resist sinking, why had no part of it ever resurfaced? Flotation materials reportedly installed within the yacht became one of the most discussed aspects of the entire case once search operations failed to recover wreckage. Additional flotation can dramatically affect how damaged boats behave after taking on water, because trapped air and buoyant materials may prevent total submersion even when hull integrity is compromised. In many marine accidents involving recreational vessels, damaged boats continue floating partially submerged for hours or even days before finally sinking completely, if they sink at all. Rescue crews frequently recover overturned hulls, drifting cabins, or sections of floating structure long after accidents occur. The total absence of such evidence in the Witchcraft case made the reported modifications appear increasingly significant rather than incidental. Marine accidents involving cabin cruisers often leave behind partially submerged hulls, floating debris, or enough visible structure for rescuers to locate the vessel afterward. Even severe nighttime collisions near harbour entrances usually produce physical evidence capable of guiding search operations toward a recovery site. Fiberglass panels, fuel containers, detached cushions, navigation equipment, and personal belongings commonly drift outward through currents after vessels are damaged. Maritime investigators rely heavily on those fragments because oceans rarely erase accidents cleanly. In the case of the Witchcraft, however, search operations across thousands of square miles failed to produce a single confirmed piece of identifiable wreckage connected to the yacht. Even boats that sink rapidly can continue trapping air inside sections of the hull, allowing portions of the wreck to remain buoyant for extended periods. Cabin cruisers with enclosed compartments sometimes resist complete submersion, long enough for debris or flotation materials to separate and rise to the surface afterward. In other maritime cases involving smaller recreational boats, rescuers have recovered floating sections of hull days after accidents occurred. This reality only strengthened the contradiction investigators faced surrounding the Witchcraft. The reported flotation system suggested the vessel should have resisted vanishing completely, yet the search operation uncovered nothing capable of verifying where or how the yacht went down. Fiberglass construction, which became increasingly common in recreational boating during that era, also changed how damaged vessels behaved after accidents at sea. Unlike older wooden boats that might break apart differently under stress, fiberglass hulls often remain structurally intact even after severe impact or flooding. That durability sometimes complicates sinking patterns because portions of the vessel can continue floating despite extensive damage below the waterline. Marine investigators familiar with recreational craft understood these characteristics well. The possibility that a fiberglass cabin cruiser equipped with additional flotation had vanished entirely without visible remains appeared increasingly difficult to reconcile with ordinary maritime behaviour. Experienced boaters familiar with Biscayne Bay later noted how unusual it seemed for a cruiser of that size to disappear completely without leaving identifiable traces on the surface. South Florida's waters had certainly witnessed accidents before. Boats grounded on reefs, hulls struck submerged objects, storms damaged smaller vessels throughout hurricane seasons. Yet even under difficult conditions, some indication of the accident typically emerged afterward. The Witchcraft appeared to violate those expectations entirely. Investigators were no longer simply confronting a missing yacht. They were confronting a disappearance that contradicted the physical behaviour expected from vessels of its type. Rather than clarifying the mystery, The reported safety modifications aboard the Witchcraft only deepened questions surrounding the yacht's final moments. If the distress call accurately reflected only minor damage after striking something underwater, the vessel should theoretically have remained afloat long enough for rescue crews to locate it. If catastrophic flooding occurred afterward, flotation materials still should have increased the chances of partial recovery or visible debris. Each possibility seemed to lead back toward the same unresolved contradiction. The yacht behaved as though it had vanished instantly beneath the surface, without leaving behind even the smallest recoverable trace. Witness accounts and later reporting suggested Burak trusted the vessel enough to treat the nighttime outing as a casual trip close to shore, rather than a risky voyage offshore. That confidence mattered because experienced boat owners generally understand the limitations of their craft. Burak reportedly considered the Witchcraft safe for the conditions surrounding Miami Harbor that evening, particularly given the calm weather and short distance from shore. Nothing about the planned excursion suggested the kind of severe maritime danger normally associated with complete disappearances at sea. The ordinary nature of the voyage continued making the outcome feel increasingly disproportionate and difficult to explain. Under ordinary maritime circumstances, rescuers responding quickly to a disabled cruiser near harbour waters would expect to encounter either the vessel itself or evidence pointing toward its fate. Time plays an enormous role during marine recoveries because floating wreckage and survivors become harder to locate as hours pass. In the Witchcraft case, however, authorities responded rapidly after receiving Burak's call. The location remained near shore, conditions were manageable, yet by the time search crews arrived near the marker buoy, the yacht had already vanished completely. The reported flotation systems only sharpened the mystery because they suggested the vessel should have remained detectable long enough for rescuers to find it. No confirmed hull fragments, flotation cushions, cabin materials, or permanently verified wreckage connected to the Witchcraft ever surfaced after the disappearance. Over time, theories surrounding the case expanded far beyond conventional boating accidents, precisely because the physical evidence remained non-existent. Maritime investigators could not study impact damage, analyse structural failure, or examine recovered debris because nothing verifiable was ever recovered from the bay or nearby Atlantic waters. The absence transformed the yacht itself into a kind of missing object suspended between documentation and speculation, known to have existed but never seen again after the distress call ended. Investigators examining the case eventually confronted an unsettling contradiction between the yacht's reported survivability features and the complete absence of recoverable evidence. Every factor that should have increased the chances of detection instead appeared to intensify the mystery surrounding the disappearance. The Witchcraft remained near shore. Rescue crews responded rapidly. The vessel reportedly possessed additional flotation. Weather conditions remained relatively calm, yet the outcome resembled disappearances occurring in violent storms or remote ocean regions, where recovery becomes nearly impossible. The yacht seemed to have bypassed every ordinary stage of maritime disaster and moved directly into total absence. As discussions surrounding the vessel continued over the years, attention slowly began shifting away from the yacht alone and toward the waters beneath its last known location. Biscayne Bay's surface often appeared calm and accessible near Miami's coastline, but below it existed channels, submerged hazards, shifting terrain, wreckage sites, and unpredictable currents unfamiliar to most people watching the bay from shore. The possibility that something beneath the water contributed to the disappearance began drawing increasing attention as investigators struggled to explain how a supposedly buoyant vessel vanished so completely. Far below the reflections of Miami's skyline, Biscayne Bay concealed underwater terrain and hidden dangers that complicated the mystery surrounding the Witchcraft. Strange waters beneath Biscayne Bay. Beneath the calm reflections surrounding Miami Harbor, Biscayne Bay concealed an underwater landscape far more unstable than it appeared from shore. Tourists standing along the waterfront often saw only smooth water carrying the glow of hotels, marinas, and passing boats across the surface after sunset. During calm weather, the bay could appear almost motionless beneath the lights of Miami, giving little indication of the terrain hidden below. Yet the waters surrounding the disappearance of the Witchcraft belonged to a marine environment shaped constantly by currents, limestone formations, dredged channels, reefs, and shifting underwater movement that complicated navigation long before the yacht vanished in December of 1967. As investigators struggled to understand how a supposedly buoyant cabin cruiser disappeared without leaving evidence behind, attention increasingly turned toward the bay itself and the hidden geography beneath the surface. Stretching along the southeastern coast of Florida, the bay connected shallow inland waters to deeper Atlantic routes through channels shaped constantly by tides and marine movement. Biscayne Bay was not simply a flat body of protected coastal water. Its geography combined open stretches of shallow seabed with deeper dredged shipping passages designed to guide commercial and recreational traffic toward Miami Harbor. Narrow cuts linked portions of the bay to the Atlantic Ocean beyond Barrier Islands, allowing tidal exchanges to influence water movement throughout the region. Even experienced boaters navigating South Florida waters understood how quickly conditions beneath the surface could change depending on currents, depth, weather, and underwater obstructions invisible from above. Hidden below many sections of the surface were limestone formations, dredged passages, coral structures, and uneven seabeds capable of complicating navigation after dark. South Florida's underwater geology developed over thousands of years through coral growth, erosion, and shifting sea levels that created irregular marine terrain beneath Biscayne Bay and nearby coastal waters. Certain sections remained shallow enough to threaten vessels drifting outside marked channels, while deeper cuts carved through the seabed allowed larger ships access toward harbour approaches. At night, especially before the widespread use of advanced electronic navigation systems, boaters relied heavily on visual markers and local familiarity to avoid submerged hazards. A minor navigational error near poorly visible obstructions could still produce serious hull damage, even close to shore. Shifting currents flowing through the openings between Biscayne Bay and the Atlantic could alter the movement of drifting objects far more quickly than casual observers realized. Water entering and leaving the bay through tidal movement created constantly changing underwater flow patterns, capable of carrying debris, fuel slicks, or floating objects away from original accident sites. Search coordinators involved in the Witchcraft case later considered those currents carefully while attempting to predict where wreckage might surface after the disappearance. Yet despite extensive calculations and expanded search grids, no confirmed debris connected to the yacht ever appeared. The currents may have complicated recovery efforts, but they still failed to explain how a vessel reportedly equipped with additional flotation disappeared so completely. Throughout the 20th century, experienced captains navigating South Florida waters learned to respect how rapidly underwater conditions could change near harbour approaches and reef systems. Even calm weather above the surface did not always guarantee safe navigation below it. Tidal movement could shift sandbars unexpectedly, while storms and dredging projects occasionally altered familiar underwater contours. Commercial traffic moving through the harbour also affected local conditions, particularly near deeper channels where propeller wash and wave movement interacted with natural currents. Biscayne Bay demanded attention from mariners precisely because much of its complexity remained hidden beneath apparently calm water. Submerged hazards scattered across portions of the bay included abandoned wreckage, rocky outcrops, sandbars, and debris capable of damaging smaller vessels under poor visibility conditions. South Florida's coastal waters had accumulated generations of maritime remains long before the Witchcraft disappeared. Grounded boats, storm-damaged vessels, forgotten debris, and older wreck sites existed throughout sections of the bay and nearby Atlantic approaches. While most hazards appeared on navigational charts or were known to local mariners, not every obstruction remained predictable, particularly in areas influenced by shifting sediment and underwater movement. Investigators considered the possibility that the Witchcraft may indeed have struck something beneath the surface, exactly as Burak reported during his distress call. The deeper mystery was what happened afterward. Long before the disappearance of the Witchcraft, maritime accidents had already contributed to the uneasy reputation surrounding waters off the Florida coastline. South Florida's position between the Gulf Stream, the Caribbean, and the Atlantic created complicated marine conditions that challenged sailors for centuries. Shipwrecks littered portions of the Florida Keys and nearby coastal routes dating back to the Spanish colonial era, when storms, reefs, and navigational uncertainty regularly destroyed vessels traveling through the region. By the 20th century, improved navigation technology reduced many of those dangers, but the waters themselves remained dynamic and unpredictable beneath the surface. Even modern search operations occasionally struggled to recover wreckage in areas influenced by currents, reefs, and variable underwater visibility. Unlike open ocean regions where wreckage may descend into extreme depths, sections of Biscayne Bay combined relatively shallow water with complex underwater terrain that often complicated recovery efforts. Shallow environments can sometimes prove deceptively difficult for investigators because wreckage may settle unevenly among coral structures, submerged debris fields, or shifting sediment. Visibility underwater also changes rapidly depending on weather, tidal disturbance, and suspended material moving through the bay. Divers operating in South Florida waters have long described areas where underwater clarity deteriorates unexpectedly, despite calm surface conditions above. Such factors complicated portions of the search surrounding the Witchcraft, though they still failed to account fully for the absence of floating debris immediately after the disappearance. Tidal exchanges moving through cuts and channels near Miami created unpredictable underwater movement patterns that investigators later considered during search calculations. Water flowing between Biscayne Bay and the Atlantic did not move uniformly across the region. Some currents accelerated through narrow openings, while calmer sections of the bay remained comparatively stable. Objects floating near the surface could drift in entirely different directions depending on timing, depth, and environmental conditions. Maritime search coordinators attempted to model those variables carefully, while expanding patrol routes after the Witchcraft vanished, yet the environmental complexity surrounding the bay only widened uncertainty instead of narrowing it. Marine charts used by local boaters identified numerous navigation hazards throughout South Florida waters, particularly for vessels operating at night outside clearly marked routes. Marker buoys, harbour lights, and designated channels existed specifically because the underwater environment required careful navigation even near Miami's coastline. Recreational boaters familiar with Biscayne Bay generally understood the importance of remaining aware of submerged terrain, especially after sunset when visual references became harder to interpret across open water. The Witchcraft had reportedly remained close to navigational areas near the harbour entrance, which made its disappearance even more difficult to reconcile with ordinary boating accidents involving hidden underwater hazards. Beyond the visible shoreline illuminated by Miami's hotels and marinas, the bay concealed a constantly changing environment shaped by erosion, currents, storms, and human dredging activity. South Florida's coastal waters were not static landscapes. Engineers regularly modified channels to accommodate growing harbour traffic, while storms periodically reshaped sections of the seabed through wave action and sediment movement. Over time, these natural and human forces created an underwater world far more complicated than the smooth surface visible from shore suggested. The contrast between Miami's brightly illuminated skyline and the unstable terrain beneath its surrounding waters contributed heavily to the eerie atmosphere surrounding the Witchcraft case. Public fascination with unexplained maritime disappearances in the region grew steadily during the decades surrounding the Witchcraft case, especially as stories connected to the Bermuda Triangle gained international attention. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, public imagination increasingly linked disappearances involving aircraft and vessels in the Western Atlantic to broader speculative narratives surrounding mysterious forces or unexplained environmental phenomena. The Witchcraft case became associated with those discussions partly because of its location near South Florida, and partly because the disappearance itself resisted ordinary explanation. Yet investigators examining the case generally remained focused on physical realities rather than sensational theories. Rather than proving supernatural explanations, many investigators pointed toward the combination of geography, weather variability, heavy marine traffic, and underwater hazards as reasons accidents sometimes became difficult to reconstruct. South Florida's waters presented genuine navigational challenges capable of complicating maritime investigations, even under relatively favourable conditions. Currents dispersed evidence, underwater terrain obscured wreckage, busy waterways introduced countless variables into search operations. Still, those realities alone did not fully resolve the central contradiction surrounding the Witchcraft. Other vessels damaged in similar environments eventually left traces behind. This yacht never did. Even so, the underwater conditions beneath Biscayne Bay still failed to explain why no confirmed wreckage from the Witchcraft ever surfaced after such an extensive search. The bay may have complicated recovery operations, but it could not entirely erase the deeper mystery that investigators continued confronting decades later. A vessel close to shore, operating during manageable weather, equipped with flotation features and reported quickly to authorities, had vanished without leaving behind the evidence that maritime searches are designed to recover. The hidden geography beneath the bay deepened the mystery surrounding the disappearance, but it never fully solved it. Decades later, the mystery continued occupying a strange space between documented maritime reality and the darker speculation surrounding South Florida's coastal waters. The Witchcraft case remained grounded in real people, real search operations, and verifiable historical records, yet the absence of physical evidence allowed increasingly broader theories to grow around the disappearance over time. Without wreckage to study or survivors to question, the case drifted gradually beyond conventional explanation and into the uncertain territory where maritime mysteries often linger for generations. As the years passed without answers, the disappearance of the Witchcraft became surrounded by theories that refused to disappear. Theories that refused to disappear. In the years following the disappearance of the Witchcraft, explanations began forming almost immediately in the absence of physical evidence. The moment search operations concluded without locating wreckage, investigators were left with a case defined more by what was missing than by what was known. No confirmed debris field, no recovered hull sections, and no verified human remains meant that every attempt at interpretation had to begin from silence. In maritime investigations, this kind of absence is unusual because even severely damaged vessels typically leave behind fragments that allow reconstruction. Yet in this case, the record remained incomplete from the very beginning, creating space for competing explanations to emerge almost immediately after the event. Among the earliest interpretations considered by investigators were straightforward maritime scenarios involving sudden capsizing or rapid sinking near shallow coastal waters. In theory, a small cabin cruiser could overturn if it struck a submerged object at speed or took on water through a compromised hull section. Biscayne Bay contained navigation hazards that made such incidents possible, particularly near channels and marker buoys where underwater terrain could shift unpredictably. However, even in a rapid sinking scenario, maritime experts expect some form of surface evidence to remain visible afterward. Air trapped inside cabins, flotation materials, or dislodged equipment usually delays complete submersion long enough for search teams to identify a location. The absence of any such indicators in the Witchcraft case made simple capsizing difficult to reconcile with the observed outcome. Operating within standard boating risk models, mechanical failure emerged as another possible explanation discussed by maritime authorities reviewing the incident. Engine malfunction, steering loss, or electrical failure can place vessels in vulnerable positions, especially at night near harbour approaches, where navigation depends on functioning systems. A disabled boat drifting near traffic lanes could theoretically collide with another object or become unstable in shifting currents. Yet even mechanical failure typically produces secondary evidence that survives the initial event. Fuel leaks, drifting parts, emergency signals, or partial wreckage often appear during subsequent searches. In the Witchcraft case, however, no confirmed mechanical signature was ever recovered, leaving this explanation incomplete on its own. As official findings remained limited, alternative narratives began circulating in public discourse, introducing the possibility of external interference or deliberate wrongdoing. These interpretations were not supported by verified evidence, but gained traction due to the absence of physical remains and the abrupt nature of the disappearance. When conventional explanations fail to produce answers, public speculation often expands into areas beyond the scope of maritime investigation. In this case, ideas involving human involvement or intentional action were discussed in various accounts over the years, though none was substantiated through documented investigation or confirmed findings. Authorities reviewing the case did not publish evidence supporting such scenarios, and they remained outside formal conclusions. Beyond structured investigations, broader environmental interpretations occasionally surfaced, focusing on rare but documented oceanic behaviours capable of affecting small vessels. Sudden shifts in currents, localized underwater turbulence, or complex interactions between tidal flows and seabed formations were sometimes referenced in discussions about what might have occurred beneath Biscayne Bay. While these phenomena exist within known oceanographic science, their documented effects do not typically result in complete disappearance without a trace. Even in dynamic coastal systems, physical remnants of a vessel usually persist in some form. The challenge in applying environmental explanations to the Witchcraft case lay not in whether such forces existed, but in whether they could account for the total lack of recoverable evidence. During the same period, public fascination with unexplained disappearances in the Western Atlantic began to influence how cases like the Witchcraft were perceived. As reports of missing aircraft and vessels accumulated across decades, a broader cultural narrative began forming around certain regions of the ocean, particularly those associated with South Florida and the wider Atlantic corridor. The Witchcraft case was gradually incorporated into this expanding framework of maritime mystery, not because it directly confirmed any larger pattern, but because it shared one defining characteristic: the absence of explanation grounded in physical recovery. Over time, this association shaped how the case was discussed outside formal investigative contexts. Rather than replacing official explanations, these cultural narratives expanded alongside them, shaping how the disappearance was discussed outside maritime circles. Media accounts and retrospective analyses often placed the Witchcraft within a broader category of unresolved maritime incidents, even though each case involved different conditions, locations, and circumstances. This blending of individual events into larger interpretive frameworks made it more difficult to separate verified facts from later reinterpretation. The yacht itself became part of a wider pattern in public imagination, even as official records remained focused on a single unresolved disappearance near Miami Harbor. Within investigative circles, however, each proposed explanation continued to face the same unresolved obstacle of missing physical evidence. Whether considering capsizing, mechanical failure, or external interference, every scenario depended on at least some recoverable trace to validate its sequence of events. Maritime investigations rely heavily on physical reconstruction, because water does not erase evidence entirely in most conditions. Objects float, sink, drift, or break apart in ways that leave patterns behind. The Witchcraft case resisted that process entirely, leaving investigators without the foundational materials normally required to confirm even partial theories. Capsizing scenarios, while plausible in certain conditions, struggled to account for the complete absence of debris typically associated with overturned or sinking vessels. Even a rapidly sinking boat near shore would generally leave identifiable markers such as floating cushions, structural fragments, or personal equipment. In many documented maritime accidents, overturned hulls remain partially visible for extended periods, allowing search crews to locate the general area of impact. The Witchcraft, however, left no such trail. The lack of surface evidence immediately following the distress call remained one of the most difficult aspects for investigators to reconcile with standard capsizing models. Mechanical failure theories explained potential loss of propulsion or navigation, yet they did not resolve how a vessel near shore could vanish without traceable remnants. Engine failure could leave a boat drifting helplessly, but it would not typically result in complete disappearance without debris or witness confirmation. Even electrical failure affecting communication systems would not prevent physical remnants from being detected during an extensive search operation conducted across both bay and nearby Atlantic waters. The gap between mechanical vulnerability and total absence of evidence continued to widen as investigators reviewed possible sequences of events. Speculation involving intentional acts or insurance-related motives emerged later, largely driven by the lack of verifiable wreckage or survivor accounts. These interpretations were fueled less by direct evidence and more by the inability of conventional explanations to account for the outcome. In maritime cases where physical proof is missing, speculation often expands into areas that cannot be conclusively proven or disproven. However, no documented investigation into the Witchcraft established confirmed evidence supporting deliberate interference, and such ideas remained outside formal findings. The persistence of these theories reflected the strength of the mystery rather than the strength of the evidence behind them. No documented evidence ever confirmed interference from external parties, leaving such interpretations classified firmly within conjecture rather than established fact. Investigators reviewing the case repeatedly returned to the same limitation. The absence of physical data prevented any definitive conclusion beyond the initial disappearance. Without wreckage, debris fields, or recovered materials, it became impossible to reconstruct events with certainty. The result was a case where explanation depended entirely on inference, rather than material reconstruction, a condition rare even in maritime investigations involving complex or severe accidents. Oceanographic discussions occasionally reference unusual wave activity or complex current interactions, though none were recorded at levels sufficient to account for total disappearance in calm conditions. While coastal waters can produce unpredictable movement patterns, especially where tidal flows intersect with channel structures, these behaviours still operate within measurable limits. Even in dynamic systems, objects displaced by currents tend to resurface or drift into recoverable areas. The Witchcraft case did not produce such outcomes, leaving environmental explanations incomplete when measured against observed search results. As each theory was examined independently, investigators repeatedly encountered the same contradiction between plausible scenarios and the absence of supporting physical findings. The process of elimination, which often narrows maritime investigations toward a single likely cause, instead produced an expanding field of uncertainty. Every explanation required at least one missing piece of evidence that never appeared. This pattern of absence, repeated across multiple frameworks, gradually defined the case more clearly than any single theory could. Even within broader maritime research, cases like the Witchcraft were often cited as examples where incomplete evidence allowed multiple interpretations to persist simultaneously. Such cases highlight a structural limitation in understanding maritime disappearances. Without physical recovery, competing explanations can remain open indefinitely. The Witchcraft did not settle into a single narrative, because no narrative could fully account for the documented conditions of its disappearance. Instead, it remained suspended between possibilities, each supported in part by logic, yet none supported by evidence. The cumulative effect of these competing explanations did not resolve the mystery, but instead reinforced how little could be confirmed beyond the original disappearance. Over time, the Witchcraft became less a case with competing answers and more a case defined by the absence of closure itself. Each theory contributed structure, but none restored certainty. What remained was a disappearance that resisted classification under any single explanatory framework, leaving investigators with more questions than the search itself had ever produced answers. Below every competing theory, attention inevitably returned to the unresolved question of who was actually aboard the Witchcraft in its final recorded moments. The men who were never seen again. When layers of interpretation eventually settle around a maritime mystery, attention inevitably drifts back toward the people who never returned from it. After the theories, the search grids, the reconstructed radio calls, and the examination of underwater geography, what remains is not just a missing vessel, but two missing individuals whose final known actions were recorded only in fragments. The Witchcraft has been analysed from every available angle, yet the human reality behind it remains fixed at a single unresolved moment near Miami Harbor. Investigators reviewing long unsolved maritime cases often return to this point, where documentation ends and uncertainty begins, because it is here that every explanation ultimately has to confront the absence of lived testimony. Born from documented accounts of South Florida boating culture in the 1960s, Dan Burack's connection to the Witchcraft placed him at the centre of a disappearance that would outlive him in public record. Burack's name appears in historical references tied to ownership and operation of the cabin cruiser, situating him within the small but active community of recreational boaters navigating Biscayne Bay during that period. South Florida's coastal waters at the time were already heavily used for both leisure and transport, and individuals like Burack operated within a familiar maritime environment shaped by short coastal routes, predictable weather windows, and routine nighttime visibility near populated shorelines. Within that context, his final voyage on the Witchcraft did not initially stand out as unusual, which is precisely why the outcome later appeared so disproportionate to the conditions that preceded it. Unlike Burack, Father Patrick Horgan entered the story through a different documented role. His presence aboard the yacht recorded as part of the final outing near Miami Harbor. Available records place him within the same departure sequence, though the specific reason for his participation is not expanded upon in surviving documentation. His inclusion aboard a recreational vessel reflects a level of familiarity or association that at the time did not raise immediate concern within the limited scope of reporting. In later examinations of the case, this detail would become one of the many points revisited by those attempting to reconstruct the final hours of the Witchcraft, not because it suggested wrongdoing, but because it highlighted how ordinary the circumstances appeared before the disappearance. On the evening before the disappearance, both men were reported to have boarded the Witchcraft under conditions described in accounts as calm, familiar, and unremarkable for coastal travel. The departure occurred within a well-travelled maritime region where vessels regularly move between marinas, channels, and nearby offshore waters without incident. Weather conditions did not suggest immediate danger, and nothing in the documented timeline indicated that the outing was expected to extend beyond a routine coastal excursion. The Witchcraft left with its owner and passenger aboard, entering waters that were heavily monitored and frequently navigated, a fact that would later intensify the mystery surrounding its absence when no subsequent sightings were confirmed. In the hours that followed their departure, no confirmed sightings were recorded after the yacht moved beyond its last known position near the marker buoy. This absence of visual or radio confirmation became a defining feature of the case, particularly because the area of operation was not isolated or remote. Miami's coastal waters supported constant maritime activity, even during nighttime conditions, with vessels regularly passing through nearby channels and harbour approaches. Despite this level of traffic, no verifiable witness account established the Witchcraft's location after its final recorded position, leaving a gap in the timeline that no subsequent investigation was able to fill with certainty. For investigators reviewing the case later, Burek's name became inseparable from the vessel itself, as ownership and operation placed him directly within the final known sequence of events. In maritime investigations, vessel ownership often becomes a central anchor point for reconstructing movement, responsibility, and decision-making leading up to an incident. In this case, however, that anchor did not provide clarity. Instead, it marked the endpoint of documentation, beyond which no physical or observational evidence extended. The Witchcraft could be traced through its departure, but not through its disappearance, leaving Burek's role recorded without corresponding resolution. Father Horgan's involvement remained equally fixed in the record, though the reasons for his presence on the vessel were not treated as unusual within the limited documentation available. Unlike cases where passenger lists reveal clear patterns of activity or intent, the Witchcraft record offers no expanded narrative explaining the context of his boarding beyond its inclusion in the final outing. This lack of elaboration does not imply significance beyond what is documented, but it does reflect the broader limitation of the case itself, a reliance on minimal records that capture presence without capturing intent. As a result, both men remain defined primarily through association with the vessel, rather than through a complete account of their final actions. As search efforts expanded and failed to produce results, both men transitioned from active individuals into names listed within unresolved maritime reports. This transition is a common feature in long-term missing vessel cases, where initial urgency gradually gives way to archival status once physical recovery efforts conclude. In the absence of wreckage or survivors, identity becomes preserved only through documentation, while the narrative of the event becomes increasingly detached from the individuals involved. For Burek and Horgan, this shift marked the point at which their disappearance entered permanent investigative record without closure. Family members and close contacts were left confronting a disappearance defined not by evidence of tragedy, but by the absence of any recoverable confirmation at all. In maritime cases with clear outcomes, families are often able to rely on physical evidence or official determination to provide at least partial resolution. In this instance, however, the lack of material findings meant that uncertainty persisted without a definitive endpoint. The absence of wreckage or confirmed remains created a situation where grief and inquiry could not resolve into conclusion, leaving only unanswered questions in place of finality. Official records from maritime authorities reflected the same limitation, noting the lack of debris, survivors, or identifiable wreckage tied to either man or the vessel. These records are notably defined by what they do not contain, as much as by what they do. The investigative outcome does not present a cause, sequence of failure, or confirmed point of loss, but instead records an inability to establish those elements. In structured maritime documentation, this level of uncertainty is uncommon, particularly in cases involving coastal waters, where recovery operations typically yield at least partial physical evidence. Over time, the absence of physical evidence meant that both Burek and Horgan remained suspended in investigative history without closure or final determination. This suspension is not metaphorical in investigative terms, but procedural, reflecting the way unresolved cases persist within archival systems. Without material findings to update or revise the record, the case remains fixed at its last verified point of contact. For the Witchcraft and its occupants, that point remains the moment the yacht passed beyond its last confirmed position near Miami's navigational markers. Even as public discussion shifted toward broader theories, no verified account ever established what specifically occurred in the final moments aboard the Witchcraft. The absence of confirmation has allowed interpretation to expand, but it has not altered the underlying record. Every theory ultimately returns to the same limitation. No documented evidence captures the transition from presence to absence. This gap remains the central feature of the case, shaping every subsequent attempt at explanation. The emotional impact of the disappearance persisted in a quieter form, carried not through dramatic testimony, but through unanswered inquiries that accumulated over time. Unlike cases resolved through recovery or official determination, this one left no physical point of closure to mark the end of uncertainty. As a result, the human aspect of the event exists primarily in ongoing absence rather than in documented resolution. That absence becomes the defining condition under which both men are remembered. Each new review of the case reinforced the same structural gap in the record, where human presence ended without transition into a confirmed outcome. Investigators revisiting the file encounter the same boundaries each time: a departure, a final position, and then nothing that can be verified beyond inference. This repeated structure of absence defines the case more clearly than any of its proposed explanations. Within maritime archives, their names became permanently linked to a single unresolved entry that continued resisting classification. The Witchcraft remains catalogued as a missing vessel case, but the individuals connected to it are equally part of that unresolved status. The record preserves their association with the yacht, but not their fate beyond it. As time moved forward beyond the original investigation, the absence of Dan Burak and Father Patrick Horgan remained unchanged beneath the same unanswered silence that followed the Witchcraft itself. Decades of silence beneath the water. The silence left by the Witchcraft did not end when theories ran out, and it carried forward into the decades that followed, where attention slowly shifted from speculation back toward whether modern tools could finally reveal what earlier searches had missed. What had once been treated as an unsolved maritime disappearance gradually became a reference point in later discussions about technological limits, especially as underwater imaging systems advanced and coastal mapping reached levels of precision once thought impossible. Yet even as capability expanded, the case itself remained unchanged in the record, fixed at the moment it vanished near Miami Harbor without a trace, as if it had never settled into any detectable layer beneath the water. With the passage of time, unresolved maritime cases like the Witchcraft often resurface not through new evidence, but through the technologies that promise to finally reveal what was once hidden. Each generation of underwater investigation has tended to approach older disappearances with renewed certainty that improved resolution, wider coverage, and more sensitive detection will eventually close long-standing gaps in the historical record. This expectation is especially strong in regions like South Florida, where dense maritime traffic, shallow coastal waters, and extensive modern surveying make it difficult to imagine that anything large could remain undiscovered indefinitely. The disappearance of Dan Burak, Father Patrick Horgan, and the yacht itself has therefore remained a recurring point of reference, not because new evidence has emerged, but because the tools used to search for it have continued to evolve. Advancements in underwater detection during the late 20th century introduced sonar systems capable of mapping the seafloor with a level of precision that earlier generations of investigators could not have achieved. These systems transformed maritime archaeology and search operations by replacing limited depth readings with structured acoustic imaging, allowing investigators to visualize contours, anomalies, and structural shapes beneath the surface. In theory, this meant that even long-submerged vessels resting on the seabed should eventually become detectable once their location fell within a surveyed area. For cases like the Witchcraft, which occurred in relatively shallow coastal waters, this technological progress created a strong expectation that the wreck would eventually be identified if it remained within the known search region. Side-scan sonar imaging, later refined through multi-beam mapping techniques, began revealing shipwrecks and submerged structures across coastal regions that had remained unexplored for decades. The principle behind these systems relies on acoustic reflections that vary depending on density, shape, and material composition on the seafloor, producing images that can distinguish between natural formations and man-made objects. Over time, these tools have been responsible for locating aircraft wreckage, commercial shipping losses, and recreational vessels that had been missing for extended periods. Even when objects are partially buried or degraded, sonar returns often preserve enough structural information to suggest their presence, making total non-detection increasingly unusual in modern surveys. Along the southeastern coast of Florida, these technologies contributed to the identification of numerous previously undocumented wreck sites scattered across channels, reefs, and deeper navigational corridors. Marine survey teams operating in the region have documented a wide range of submerged remains, reflecting centuries of continuous maritime activity in one of the most heavily travelled coastal environments in the United States. Some discoveries involved older wooden vessels preserved under sediment layers, while others included more recent fiberglass wrecks located near shipping routes and reef systems. Each successful identification reinforced the broader assumption that modern sonar technology had significantly reduced the likelihood of long-term maritime disappearances remaining unsolved in mapped waters. Despite these successes in surrounding waters, repeated attempts to reconcile older missing vessel cases with modern sonar data produced results that were often incomplete or inconclusive. Investigators returning to archival search zones associated with historic disappearances frequently found that updated scans either produced no relevant anomalies or revealed objects that could not be definitively matched to known vessels. In many cases, this was attributed to environmental change, incomplete historical positioning data, or limitations in early search accuracy. However, the expectation remained that at least some residual signature of a vessel like the Witchcraft would be detectable if it still rested within the surveyed coastal system. Sediment movement along the seabed of Biscayne Bay introduced an additional complication, as shifting layers of sand and organic material could gradually obscure or distort submerged objects over time. Coastal environments are not static, and the seabed in shallow waters often changes shape due to tidal forces, storms, dredging activity, and natural sediment transport. These processes can bury wreckage beneath layers that reduce sonar reflectivity or alter how acoustic signals return to the surface. While this does not erase physical structures, it can make detection significantly more complex, particularly when searching for smaller vessels without large structural signatures. In shallow coastal environments influenced by tides and storm activity, even large structural remnants can become partially buried or visually indistinguishable from natural formations. Unlike deeper offshore wrecks that tend to remain relatively stable, shallow water sites are subject to constant environmental reshaping. Sandbars shift, channels deepen or fill, and underwater vegetation can develop around submerged objects, further complicating identification. These conditions are well documented in marine surveying literature and are considered a known limitation in coastal sonar interpretation, particularly in areas with high sediment variability such as South Florida. Marine researchers reviewing historical data from South Florida frequently noted how dynamic underwater conditions reduced the reliability of single-point scans conducted long after an incident occurred. As time passes between an event and a renewed search, environmental changes can alter both the position and visibility of submerged objects, requiring broader survey strategies to compensate for uncertainty. This makes historical reconstruction more complex, as investigators must account not only for original impact location, but also for decades of environmental transformation. In the case of older disappearances, the gap between initial conditions and modern survey environments can become significant enough to affect interpretive outcomes. When earlier search data for the Witchcraft was compared against later imaging capabilities, investigators encountered a consistent absence of any identifiable trace matching the vessel's specifications. Despite expanded coverage and improved resolution, no confirmed sonar return has ever been linked to the yacht in subsequent re-examinations of the area. This absence persists even in surveys designed to account for sediment shifts and expanded drift modelling. The expectation that improved imaging would eventually locate the wreck has not been fulfilled, leaving the case structurally unchanged within modern datasets. Modern re-examinations of archival search grids produced no confirmed detection, despite the theoretical capability of newer systems to locate objects far smaller than a 23-foot cruiser. Advances in acoustic imaging have made it possible to detect increasingly subtle variations on the seafloor, including small debris fields and partially degraded structures. In many coastal recovery operations, objects that were once considered lost beyond retrieval have been identified through refined sonar interpretation. Yet the Witchcraft remains absent from these updated analyses, even when historical coordinates are revisited under modern scanning parameters. Across other regions of Florida waters, sonar surveys successfully located wrecks believed lost for centuries, reinforcing expectations that even older disappearances could eventually be resolved. These discoveries have contributed to a broader understanding of how maritime history accumulates physically beneath coastal environments, often preserved in unexpected ways. However, this broader success makes unresolved cases more notable by contrast, particularly when similar conditions produce different outcomes. The continued absence of the Witchcraft stands out within this pattern of increasing recoveries across the region. Yet within the specific area surrounding Miami Harbor and Biscayne Bay, no subsequent imaging effort has ever produced a verified signature corresponding to the missing yacht. This continued absence has remained consistent across multiple generations of survey technology, each more advanced than the last. While environmental explanations and limitations in historical data are considered, the persistence of non-detection remains a defining feature of the case. It is not simply that the yacht has not been found, but that it has not been detected at all within the systems designed to reveal it. This contrast between technological progress and persistent absence became one of the defining features of renewed interest in the case during later decades. As expectations of resolution increased alongside technological capability, the lack of closure became more pronounced. The Witchcraft case gradually shifted from being an unsolved disappearance to an example of how even advanced systems can fail to produce confirmation in certain conditions. The more capable the tools became, the more striking the silence appeared. As marine science continued to evolve, investigators found themselves confronting not just a historical disappearance, but a present-day failure of detection under increasingly advanced conditions. What had once been framed as a limitation of mid-20th century search capability gradually transformed into a modern investigative challenge. Each improvement in methodology highlighted the same unresolved gap, reinforcing that the absence was not simply a product of outdated technology, but a continuing condition within contemporary analysis. Within contemporary discussions of maritime archaeology, the Witchcraft remained an unresolved anomaly, resistant even to the tools designed to eliminate uncertainty in underwater searches. The case persists within technical and historical review because it does not conform to expected patterns of detection, recovery, or degradation. While most maritime losses eventually leave some recoverable trace, this case remains defined by the absence of such evidence across every modern system applied to it. Despite every advance in underwater detection and decades of renewed examination, the Witchcraft continues to exist only in records, with nothing recovered to anchor its final moments to the seafloor below. The case that still haunts American waters, maritime investigators rarely treat a case as fully closed when no physical evidence has ever been recovered, because the absence of material confirmation leaves open questions that later methods continue to revisit. Maritime records occasionally preserve cases that never transition from active investigation into confirmed resolution, remaining instead as open entries that persist across decades of review. These cases are not defined by a lack of documentation, but by the absence of anything that can be conclusively attached to the end of their narrative. In most maritime incidents, even when circumstances are unclear, some form of physical residue eventually anchors the event in material reality. The Witchcraft, however, remains recorded only in its departure and in the failure to account for what followed. In South Florida's Coastal Archive of Maritime Incidents, the Witchcraft stands out not because of what was discovered, but because of what was never recovered despite extensive search efforts. The waters near Miami are among the most heavily monitored maritime environments in the United States, with constant vessel traffic, navigational oversight, and long-term environmental study. In such a setting, the expectation of eventual discovery is not speculative but procedural. Yet this case remains an exception, defined not by complexity of recovery, but by the complete absence of a recoverable endpoint. Statistical analysis of vessel disappearances in heavily trafficked waters near major harbours typically shows at least partial physical recovery, even in cases involving severe damage or rapid sinking. Hull fragments, flotation materials, fuel traces, or identifiable debris fields are commonly documented in post-incident investigations. These remnants allow authorities to reconstruct sequences of failure and confirm points of impact or sinking. In contrast, the Witchcraft left no verified material trail that could be integrated into such reconstruction models, placing it outside the expected range of maritime outcomes. Repeated historical assessments have returned to this case, largely because its evidentiary profile does not align with expected outcomes for coastal maritime loss. Each review has attempted to reconcile the disappearance with known categories of maritime failure, including collision, mechanical breakdown, and environmental disruption. However, these frameworks depend on the presence of at least minimal physical confirmation. Without it, classification becomes provisional rather than conclusive, leaving the case structurally unresolved regardless of interpretive approach. Maritime historians referencing unresolved disappearances often cite the Witchcraft as an example where documentation exists without corresponding physical verification. This distinction is important in archival practice, where the existence of records does not necessarily imply the existence of confirmable evidence. The vessel's departure, last known position, and subsequent disappearance are all documented within historical accounts. Yet none of these records extend into the material aftermath that typically defines maritime resolution. As a result, it occupies a unique position in discussions of incomplete maritime histories. Along the waters surrounding Miami, long-term environmental stability and continuous navigation activity generally increase the likelihood of debris detection over time. Coastal currents, dredging operations, and commercial traffic tend to expose or displace submerged objects, often bringing older wreckage into detectable range. In many documented cases, vessels lost for extended periods are eventually located through either direct sonar identification or incidental recovery during unrelated operations. The absence of any such discovery in this case remains a notable deviation from regional patterns. This expectation makes the complete absence of identifiable wreckage in this case particularly difficult to reconcile with standard recovery models. Even accounting for sediment movement, underwater vegetation, and shifting seabed conditions, modern interpretation methods are designed to detect anomalies consistent with man-made structures. The inability to isolate any confirmed signature associated with the Witchcraft suggests either an exceptional set of environmental conditions or a gap in available historical positioning data that has never been resolved through subsequent analysis. Institutional review processes for unresolved maritime incidents periodically reassess older cases when new methodologies become available for reanalysis. These reviews are not driven by speculation, but by procedural standards intended to ensure that historical conclusions remain valid under improved technological conditions. In the case of the Witchcraft, repeated reassessments have incorporated advances in sonar resolution, archival mapping, and environmental reconstruction models. Despite these improvements, the core outcome has remained unchanged across all documented reviews. Each of these reviews has consistently encountered the same limitation. No confirmed material trace has ever been linked to the Witchcraft in updated datasets. This absence persists across multiple generations of search technology, each designed to reduce the likelihood of undetected wreckage in coastal waters. The consistency of non-detection across different methodologies has gradually become a defining characteristic of the case, shaping how it is interpreted within both technical and historical contexts. For investigators specializing in coastal wreck recovery, cases without even partial signature data are uncommon within regions subject to continuous sonar mapping. In most operational environments, even degraded or heavily buried vessels leave detectable anomalies when scanned under appropriate conditions. The fact that this case does not conform to that pattern has made it a reference point in discussions about the limits of detection rather than a standard example of maritime loss. It exists outside the typical success range of recovery operations. Comparative studies of maritime loss often group unresolved cases based on available evidence, yet this particular incident remains isolated due to its total lack of physical indicators. While other disappearances may involve incomplete wreckage, unverified sightings, or partial environmental traces, the Witchcraft case does not consistently align with any of these categories. This isolation is not interpretive but structural, based on the absence of measurable data that could place it within established recovery frameworks. As archival systems evolve, the Witchcraft continues to appear in technical discussions as a case defined more by absence than by reconstructible event sequence. Its presence in maritime literature is maintained not because of discoveries, but because it continues to challenge assumptions about how disappearance should be resolved under modern investigative standards. Each reference to the case reinforces the same central issue. that some recorded events resist closure even under conditions designed to produce it. Within analytical frameworks used to categorize maritime disappearances, it occupies a rare classification where neither location nor debris field has been confirmed. This lack of foundational data prevents the case from being fully integrated into predictive models used to understand vessel loss patterns. Without a confirmed endpoint, it remains outside the statistical structures that normally allow investigators to refine future search strategies based on past outcomes. Over successive decades of review, its status has remained unchanged despite advancements in detection, mapping, and underwater imaging capabilities. Technological progress has expanded the boundaries of what can be identified beneath coastal waters, yet it has not altered the absence at the centre of this case. Each improvement in methodology has refined the understanding of surrounding conditions, but none have produced a direct connection to the vessel itself. In modern maritime research, few incidents near major urban coastlines remain entirely unverified by physical evidence at any stage of investigation. Most cases eventually yield at least partial resolution, whether through recovered fragments, environmental correlation, or confirmed wreck identification. The Witchcraft remains one of the exceptions when none of these pathways has resulted in verification, leaving it structurally incomplete within both historical and scientific records. Even after prolonged institutional scrutiny, the case continues to resist closure, maintaining a position defined entirely by what has not been found. This persistence of absence has become its most consistent feature, overshadowing every attempt at explanation or reconstruction. It is not only that the vessel is missing, but that nothing has ever been found to suggest where missing should begin to resolve. Across the historical record of American maritime incidents, it persists as an unresolved entry whose final condition has never been materially confirmed. Its presence in archives is stable, but its meaning remains open, suspended between documentation and disappearance without transition into resolution. The documentation of the Witchcraft ultimately concludes without resolution, leaving behind only a recorded departure and a silence that no subsequent investigation has ever been able to convert into a definitive ending.